Sorry, seems like we're getting some feedback. Let's try to give it a second.
Okay. Okay. I think we're good now. Thank you for your patience, everyone, while we figured that out. As always, in this new world, we are dealing with some technical issues, so I appreciate your patience. Thank you for joining us for our Geology of National Park series, Glacier National Park. My name is Mattie, and I'm the program manager at Girl Scouts of Silver Sage, located in Boise, Idaho. And I'm joined here with our program coordinator, Sarah Tetzoff. So we are going to be talking about the geology of Glacier National Park, and you might be wondering, why are we talking to you about geology? So my background in geoscience, I studied geoscience in both Utah and at Boise, or in Idaho. And I also taught geoscience to high schoolers and volunteered at the Idaho Museum of Mining and Geology. Sarah, would you like to share your background?
Before we do that, I have a comment that says we can't hear anything on Facebook. So let's see if we can keep going. Yeah, so I studied geology at Idaho State University, and I got my bachelor's in geology from there. I also I taught geology to middle schoolers in Idaho Falls for a year, and I have done a couple of research trips and done a lot of hiking in the area.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Also, this is Josie Cat. This is my cat. She's joining us today. She loves geology, loves rocks. So for those of you who have not joined us before, we've done some other national parks. So if you have any questions, please drop them into the comments and we will try our best to answer them or find the answers for you. We are going to be doing a quick overview of Glacier National Park. We'll then go over to Sarah to do a tour of the park. We'll talk a bit about the geomorphology and glaciology of this park, so how it was created. This park is also known for some cool fossils, so Sarah will take us around on some of those fossils. And lastly, we will cover another career in geoscience, so this one specifically a glaciologist. So Sarah, firstly, Glacier National Park was established in May of 1910. It is over 1,500 square miles, and it's glacier carved, so that's why the name Glacier National Park. And it's in Montana and also runs along Canada.
All right, I think we're ready for the tour. So this is a map of Glacier National Park. It is a pretty large park, as Mattie said. It's almost 1,500 or over 1,500 square miles. And there are really cool places to go in this park, including some hiking, some backpacking. There's a bunch of boating that you can do and fishing and things like that. So I just decided to show you a couple of really cool places, some that I've been to, some that I haven't been to. So the first one is called Lake McDonald. So this is probably the most famous lake in the park. So if you've seen a picture of Lake McDonald or of Glacier, it was probably of Lake McDonald. And it's very famous because the pebbles in the lake are all sorts of different colors, and it makes a really good picture. And the reason that those rocks are all sorts of different colors is because of the iron in them. So it has to do with where they were deposited, when they were deposited, and how much iron or how much air they were exposed to. So those red rocks that we see in the picture are rocks or sediments that were deposited when we had a shallow ocean or some shallow water in this area. And so they were exposed to a lot more air. And so when rocks with iron are exposed to air, they do something called oxidize. So it's the same idea as something rusting. So if we have a piece of metal that gets wet and gets exposed to air after a really long time, you're going to see it start to turn red. That's the same thing that happened to these rocks. Now, the other rocks are the greens or the blue rocks, and those are also iron-rich rocks, but those are ones that were deposited in a much deeper environment, and so they weren't as exposed to the air. In millions and millions and millions of years, they will turn the same color as those red rocks, but they just haven't had the time yet to catch up. The second place is called Logan Pass. This is on the Going to the Sun Road, and this is pretty much the middle of the road. It's the highest elevation that you can reach in the park by car at over 6,000 feet above sea level. And it's also the location for the Continental Divide. And the Continental Divide means that this is where the river, or this is the place that decides which way the rivers are flowing. So anything west of this place, those rivers flow into the Pacific Ocean. And anything east of this place, those rivers flow into the Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico. And so this mountain that you see, the second one, that's called Triple Divide Peak. That actually is the boundary for the Arctic Ocean as well. So anything north of that mountain, all of those rivers flow north into the Arctic Ocean. So it's a really cool place if you're at all interested in rivers or oceans or anything like that. All right, the third place is called Many Glaciers. There's a wonderful hotel there. It's probably I think it's the oldest hotel in the park, and it's a gorgeous little area. And any geologist sees this picture, and it's amazing. This place is where many, many glaciers once called home that aren't there anymore or have gotten a lot smaller over time. The really distinct feature in this picture and in this area is called a horn. And that's what you see in the left part of the picture, that spiky mountain there, that's a horn. And we'll tell you more about how those formed later on. And several glaciers carved these valleys, and we'll show you later again how they carved these valleys. Okay, the last place is my personal favorite place in the whole park. This is called Avalanche Lake. This is a 4-mile round trip hike in the woods, up the mountains, and you can only get there by walking. And it's a really popular hiking trail. A lot of people go up and down it, but the view at the very end makes the whole hike worth it because it's just one of the most beautiful places. It's fed by the Sperry Glacier. So way up top of that mountain, on top of those cliffs, is a glacier that is feeding this lake and is letting the water flow down. And then the water flows down into the other lakes in Glacier National Park. All right, Mattie, you ready to tell them about glaciation?
Yeah. So there are at least 35. Are they showing yet? So there are at least 35 named glaciers in the park, but only 26 are active glaciers today. The majority of these glaciers grew during the last ice age, so around 10,000 years ago, but they have been retreating since 1850. Researchers initially thought that the glaciers would be gone by around this year, but estimates have changed to push out as far as 2030. The majority of this incredible landscape that you can see in Glacier National Park can be explained by glacial activity in this area. So all of these pictures, except for the bottom middle one, are from Glacier National Park, but all of these features are things caused by glaciers. And we'll go into what those are in just a moment. Losing these glaciers in the park will have a significant consequence for the park and impact its ecosystem. The glaciers feed lakes and rivers throughout the year, and without them, there might be less water. So that could impact native populations like bull trout. And another impact of losing these glaciers is that it would increase the rate of wildfires. So it can increase how long the season is or how intense the season is. Sarah, next slide, please.
Sorry, my mouse has decided to stop working.
Oh, you're good. So the mountains of Glacier National Park began forming 170 million years ago when ancient sedimentary rocks, so think sandstones or limestones, were forced upward and over much younger rocks. So this was during the creation of the Rocky Mountains. These sedimentary rocks are considered to be some of the best places to find fossils, especially of early life on Earth. This also causes the rocks on top to be younger than the rocks on bottom, which is something interesting if you remember our Grand Canyon episode 2 weeks ago. Something that we know in geology is the law of superposition, which means that older things are on the bottom and younger things are on top. But because this rock was uplifted, it's opposite in this case, which is really interesting. The current shape of some of these mountain ranges and the positions and sizes of the lakes are really good evidence of massive glacier action. This has carved out U-shaped valleys that you might have seen in some of the other photos. This one is of an active glacier.
We can go back if you would like.
Yeah, actually, yeah, let's do that. It also, so which one? So the top left is a good one of a U-shaped valley. It also would have left moraines, which are kind of large masses of dirt that a glacier drags down the mountain. And those moraines can back up water to create lakes, which have some really cool names that we'll get into. So, as I said earlier, of the estimated 150 glaciers that were initially in the park, 26 remain today. So, Sarah, if you'll go to that next picture, I'm going to talk about some of the different features of a glacier. And this will help you to imagine what was there to cause Glacier National Park to look like it does today. So some of those are the U-shaped valleys. So the reason it has that shape is a glacier is extremely good at erosion and is able to pull the dirt and rocks from the side and bottom of the valley and really carve it out. It also weakens the rocks along the sides of that valley and enable it to fall in a lot easier. Part of that, if you can see how there's kind of a glacier coming into this one, almost like a stream coming in. When this glacier recedes, that'll leave something called a hanging valley. So that valley will be much higher than the main valley. It'll look like it's kind of falling off, and there might be waterfalls there. That's something that you see a lot in Yosemite National Park. Let's go to the next picture. So this is evidence of glaciations. You can see the glacier is not actually here anymore, but this is a really good picture of some of the things we see. So the glacial trough is that main area the glacier would have scooped out, and it does look like a trough that you might have like animals eat out of. The hanging valley goes into it. And some cool things are the horn. So if you've heard of the Matterhorn, that's what that middle point is. And coming off of those are arêtes. So these lines coming off of the horn are called arêtes. And that's a really cool one. You can see from Google Earth really easy, especially if you go into like the Alps on Google Earth and you can point them out. Another one is called a Paternoster Lake. So these will form in those hanging valleys, in the valleys of those arêtes. And they look like beads on a necklace, but they're lakes. So those are Paternoster lakes. And last are cirques, which are those valleys, I guess, around the horn. All right, so let's turn it over to Sarah for some fossils now.
Well, first we're going to talk about how to find glaciers on Google Earth. So this is probably one of my favorite hobbies. I like to just play on Google Earth. And something that's really cool about learning about glaciers is you can start to see them or the evidence of them in Google Earth. So something that we've been trained to do is look for these very long, elongated oval shapes that have lakes in them, usually, because usually glaciers end up in lakes. And so if you look here closely, you can kind of start seeing those U-shaped, or not the U-shaped, those oval-shaped lakes. And so I circled some of them. And so you can see that Lake McDonald is one of them. So there are a ton. I didn't even circle all of them. There's so many more in this park, in this mountain range, that have been formed by different glaciers, but these are just a few of them, some of the more obvious ones. So next up, just like Mattie said, we're going to start talking about the rocks and the fossils that we find in the park. So these rocks, the oldest ones that you'll find in this park are almost 1.6 billion years old. So those are incredibly old, even for geologists. If you think about it, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. The oldest rock known by man is only 4 billion years old, is over 4 billion years old. So these are pretty dang old in comparison. These are mainly sedimentary rocks. They're an inland. They came from an inland sea, which is why you see these ripple marks on the rocks that I'm showing up on this slideshow. When rocks have low seas or have rivers running through them, you tend to see these ripple marks show up, and these are called trace fossils. So trace fossils are evidence that something happened to rock. So we're not going to see an actual fossil of a bone, we're just going to see evidence of something being there. The next one is evidence of life. So here we have an actual fossil. These are probably some of the coolest fossils in the whole world to me. They're called stromatolites, and stromatolites are fossiled algae, and these are microbacteria. They grow like trees, so you can kind of see the rings, and I'll show you a couple more pictures later on. You can see the rings forming, and they grow just like trees, ring by ring by ring, and you can still actually see them in shallow oceans now. If you go down to the coast of southern Australia by the Great Barrier Reef, they have some there. They probably have some in the Caribbean. I don't know, I've never been to the Caribbean, but yeah, they're still alive today. But this is the first life form that we have ever recorded in Earth's history. So that's really cool that the park has so many of them, and you can just walk right by them as you're hiking in the park. They're all sorts of different colors. They come in blue, green. I've seen them in dark gray. But for the most part, the oldest ones have been weathered away or weathered into the color of the rock itself. All right, the next one, we have an intrusion of magma. And so that kind of surprised me. At first, I was thinking this is all sedimentary rocks, but no, we had magma here. We had volcanic activity. And so what we have here, if you look very, very closely at this mountain, there is a very horizontal black line across the front of the mountain. And what that is it is called, let me see if I have a name for it. It doesn't have an exact name, but it's a diorite. It's an igneous rock. So this is kind of something that you would find. So what happens here is we have a magma chamber or some kind of pocket of magma, and the pressure gets high enough that it splits the rock open, and it kind of just seeps into the little cracks and makes its way through the rock and cools there. And what's really cool about this is the rock changes as the lava comes through because it gets so hot. So on the edges of these, you see different types of minerals that you wouldn't normally see in sedimentary rocks. All right, the next section was called a thrust fault or a reverse fault. So this is where Mattie was talking earlier about how some of the rocks on top are older than some of the rocks on bottom. So that happens when we have something called a reverse fault. And what happens with this is an earthquake occurs. And usually when an earthquake occurs, we get a drop in the valley, kind of like where Mount Bora or any usual earthquake. But if we have a reverse fault, these older rocks get pushed up. And so all of a sudden we have these older rocks laying on top of newer rocks. And those older rocks are metamorphic rocks. So these are rocks that started off as sedimentary or igneous and have been changed by heat and pressure and become new types of rocks, like gneiss is one of them. I love, that's one of my favorite metamorphic rocks. And we see these different minerals and combinations of rocks in these things. And just like we talked about 2 weeks ago, we have the rock cycle. And all of these things all these rocks can become other rocks through time. They get heated, they can become magma, which makes them an igneous rock. So just to remember that just because a rock is metamorphic doesn't mean it's always going to be metamorphic. All right, then we hit about 2 million years ago is when the largest glaciation occurred in Glacier National Park in this area. This was probably the glaciation event for Glacier National Park. This is where the biggest glaciers they have came from. This happened in what we call the Pleistocene era, and we saw large sheets of ice advancing all over North America. And this lasted all the way up until 10,000 years ago. That's when those glaciers started retreating. These glaciers went all the way down into southern Idaho. We have evidence of glacier activity in some of the mountains around here. And think about it, humans were alive when the last ice age was ending. So we have evidence of human activity from the last ice age. And this is when we had woolly mammoths and ground sloths, and I don't want to, what's the cat? I can't remember what the cat's called.
Saber-tooth?
It's not called a saber-tooth though. But it's kind of like a saber-tooth cat. But those are the things that we saw running around at that time. So if you've seen Ice Age, you're probably pretty familiar with the animals that you saw then. Okay, and then the last glaciation of Glacier National Park was about 6,000 years ago, so not long at all in geologic terms. So this resulted in about 26 more glaciers to come to the park. All of them are now named, and they're between 6,000 and 8,000 years old. And this period of glaciation ended around 1850, so just over 180 years ago. So not much at all. All right, so as geologists, we love something called a cross-section. And so what this is we take point A and point B, and we draw what we see between it. And then we, with lots of scientific research, draw the layers that we would see below the surface of this area, this A to B area. So this is what it looks like. This is a cross-section of Glacier National Park. So these are the different formations. So last time we talked about Grand Canyon having different formations, like the Kaibab formation and things like that. So this place has the same exact thing, except for it has its own formation. So here we have the Shepherd Formation, the Pritchard Formation, the Empire Formation. All of these are different types of rocks, just like we just talked about, those magmatic rocks, those metamorphic, and those sedimentary rocks. Sorry, I just saw Tally said Smilodon, and that's what I was looking for. Smilodon. It distracted me. All right, and just like I promised, these are some more pictures of different stromatolites. So the top two are actually from Glacier National Park. So these are things that you can find just walking around Glacier National Park. The other two are pictures I found online. But if you look down at the bottom left one, you see there's a Sharpie for scale. And so that stromatolite was massive compared to that Sharpie. Other ones can be the size of a quarter or any size you want. So as long as they live, they're growing. All right. Yeah, I'm doing preservation. So as Mattie said earlier, these glaciers are disappearing on us. Researchers thought that the glaciers would be gone by 2020. They're not quite yet, but they're very much receding. They're getting a lot smaller than they were even 20, 30 years ago. And that's because global CO2 levels have been increasing since the industrial era, which was about the 1900s, early 1900s. This is when humans started using machinery to get things done. So this is when factories were booming, when cars were being made, when we started using fuel to make our products instead of making them by ourselves, which wasn't a bad thing. The Industrial Revolution was great for humans. I mean, we wouldn't have the things we have today if we didn't have the Industrial Revolution. But if you see here, we had a pretty steady amount of global CO2, all the way from 1000 AD all the way up to about 1850 AD. And then that's when it starts going up. And it doesn't go up just gradually, it goes up astronomically in the 2000s. And this is why we're having those concerns of glacial melting. This is depleting the ozone. It's creating an environment that these glaciers can't survive in. It's creating this warmer environment for them. So the next thing I wanted to show you was some of the glaciers at Glacier National Park that were there 30 years ago that aren't really there as much today. So the first one here is called Shepherd Glacier, and this was a hanging glacier. Hanging glaciers are gorgeous to see in real life, but this is what it looks like today. There's nothing left. There's only a little bit of snow left. And we have Grinnell Glacier. This is probably, in geologist terms, one of the most famous glaciers at Glacier National Park. It's named after the founder of the park, so you can see it has a pretty large significance to everyone. This is what it looks like today. And so there's not a ton left of it. Pretty much the only part of it that's officially left is the part at the very top of the lake. But all that's really left is the giant lake left over and the rocks. And this is Jackson Glacier. This is another pretty cool glacier that people studied all over the world. They came from all over the world to hike this and to study it. And this is what's left of it today. And so what you're seeing is this increase in CO2, an increase in temperature. Like Mattie was saying, we're having more fire seasons. The seasons are longer. They're hurting they're hurting the natural animals that live in this area. The lakes are becoming warmer and the trout can't live in them anymore, so they're leaving. And so look at the dates as well. That's not even 100 years between these two. I think there's just over 100 years on Grinnell Glacier and just over 100 years for Shepherd Glacier. So 100 years is nothing in geologic time. And so right now they're predicting that these glaciers won't make it to 2030, which is in our lifetimes. All right, Mattie.
I did too when I come off of that there's a really good documentary about glaciology called Chasing Ice by James Baylog. He has also done a lot of photography and like activism around glaciology. It was, I'm sure, for a lot of younger geologists, like the documentary that made us like, whoa, for this type of topic. And I highly recommend watching it. He documents glaciers throughout much of his lifetime and is really able to show the impact that people have on glaciers and that glaciers have on people. He also shows some really cool aspects of glaciers that you don't get to see unless you actually visit them. So I highly suggest, if you are able to find it, I know it's for rent on Amazon, but Chasing Ice by James Baylog, if you're interested further in glaciology and glaciers that have been receding. I also wanted to take a moment. I know we've thrown a lot of information at you, so if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We would love to answer them or help to find an answer for you. And so our last segment is going to be on a career. So we are going to talk about glaciology. A typical day for a glaciologist can look very different, as it would for any geoscientist. But imagine that you are working in one of the coldest and remote, breathtakingly beautiful places in the world. The sun is low in the sky, and the sub-zero wind is blowing fiercely across your face. You have a crash helmet on and a climbing harness super tight, and you're lowered into an ice crevasse 15 meters deep. You're a glaciologist, and you're with a team of scientists and mountaineers that are on a surging glacier, studying its characteristics and movement. You and your climbing partners might descend into the crevasse and gather data from a series of markers on the glacier's surface and record their positions. Those markers will tell you the difference about the glacier's movement, in what direction, how much, and when you resurvey these markers, you can learn and collect more information about how this glacier is changing. The data that you gather from your expeditions will add to your understanding of the glacier and its role and impact on the environment. As I said, duties vary very significantly in any science job, honestly. But for a glaciologist, your day-to-day job might include some of the following. You might conduct research on ice sheets, shelves, fields, and caps, as well as in alpine, so mountain, and Arctic glaciers and snow. You might collect samples of ice and snow to test for various criteria, including physical properties, chemical properties, and even evidence of life, like Sarah said, with stromatolites. You might get to design your own experiments, both in the lab and in the field, and write reports on your findings and create research on that. You also might get to install and test instruments by hiking out into these really beautiful places and installing them. You'll get to communicate with the media and general public on historical and modern glacial activity. And I think, honestly, kind of the coolest part is you get to collaborate with other glaciologists, geologists, and STEM professionals. Honestly, any professional in this field. So it's a really amazing career to look into. So yeah. All right. So it looks like we are starting to get a couple questions. Sarah, do you know why glaciers look so blue?
I would have to assume it's the water and the ice reflecting the sediment below. So we see, I don't know if you've seen pictures of lakes like Lake Louise or Lake Moraine up in Alberta, Canada, but they're very, very blue, bright, bright blue. And the reason for that is they have sediments below them. So when a glacier erodes valleys, they grind the sediment so, so fine, finer than most sediments are that geologists study. And those sediments are they get reflected in the lake's water. And it also has to do with the type of rock that you see as well. A lot of limestones like to reflect this blue. And so we see that sediment, that very, very fine sediment reflecting. So I could assume, I'm assuming, I'm not completely positive, but I'm assuming it's the sediment that's been eroded away below the glacier being reflected with the sunlight.
Yeah, that could have some effect, especially for like you said, the lakes. One of the reasons the glaciers are so blue is just that ice reflects, like you said in the beginning, ice reflects red light. And so the deeper you get, the deeper that light is going, the more red and white light is reflecting, the deeper blue it gets. But yeah, that's so true. Especially, I bet that attributes like why Lake McDonald has such a reputation for being like crystal clear, and the beautiful rocks underneath is from all that sediment.
Yeah, the water from glaciers is very, very clear because it has very little contaminants in it. I got to walk on a glacier just last year, just as a family trip, and I got to take some water from the glacier, and it was so, so clear and so, so cold. All right, I see, where can you see glaciers? So glaciers are pretty much anywhere, and I'm going to tie this to another question from Stacy. Can glaciers be in a warm climate? That's pretty much the only place that glaciers cannot be, is a warm climate, because ice can't survive in a warm climate. But if you look at places like Canada, there's many, many glaciers there. There's a couple of glaciers in the Teton Mountain Range. If you are from Eastern Idaho or even from Idaho, you know where the Tetons are. They are a mountain range just east of us. There's a lot of really cool glaciers down in Argentina, southern Argentina. One of the coolest glaciers in my opinion, one of the coolest glaciers is called Puerto Moreno. It's one of the, I think, 10 glaciers that are still advancing in the world. So most glaciers are retreating, so they're melting. But there's a handful of glaciers that are still moving forward and still advancing, getting bigger. And that's one of them. And if you get there at the right time, you can actually see it do something called calving, which means a sheet of ice from the front of it will just break off into the water. And so that's one of the coolest, one of my favorite glaciers. It's on the bucket list.
Yeah, I will say too, yeah, glaciers, but the cool thing about glaciers is you'll find evidence of them almost everywhere. So active glaciers today, everywhere that Sarah was saying, but you can find evidence of glaciation in the Grand Canyon, in the desert, and like all over. And so something I enjoyed, because glaciers and geomorphology was a special interest of mine, was when I went on trips with my family or with anyone, was looking at places and being like, whoa, something happened here. I wonder how this happened, and trying to figure out, okay, a glacier might have been here, even though it's a dry desert now. So that's a really cool thing about them. Nellie had another question about red light. So the initial question was, why are glaciers blue? And my answer, I'll explain it again. So light is on a spectrum, so the RGB of the whole spectrum, and when light interacts with certain things, some of those colors might bounce off or be absorbed or pass through, and that's why you see certain colors. And so with ice, I was saying that the red light is being absorbed along with some white light, and it's bouncing off blue. And so we see the blue light because the rest is being absorbed into the ice. And this is also like why the sky is blue. That light, all the light is being absorbed, it's bouncing off blue. That's what we're saying.
I see a question from Stacy. What can we do to help them not melt? So that's a really great question, and you've probably already heard the answer. I like to say it as the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. Anything that you've heard to help the environment, recycling your paper, recycling your canned goods, using reusable containers instead of plastic containers because they take so much more to be produced. Using a reusable water bottle. You can even make them look pretty like I have. I have a water bottle that I take literally everywhere and it's got stickers all over it. But that's what I use instead of using plastic water bottles. So anything you can think of that could help the environment is going to help glaciers.
I also make sure that you are supporting organizations that are supporting glaciers. So that's a really big step because, yes, what we do individually is so important, and we need to make sure that there are other people doing the same thing as us. So make sure you're doing research into the things that you're buying and who you're supporting, and so that way you can ensure that your practices are helping glaciers, are helping the ocean, are helping, there's so many ways that you can help just by being aware of where all of your stuff is going.
I had a t-shirt a few years ago from Coca-Cola, and it was actually made of recycled plastic bottles. So that's probably one of my favorite t-shirts. I see Nellie asked, are there caves in glaciers? Yes, there are many, many caves. There's caves and then there's crevasses. So crevasses are cracks in the glacier that can be anywhere from a couple of feet deep to as far deep as the glacier is. And they can be pretty deadly because they're usually covered in snow. And so people have to be very careful when they're hiking because they could fall into one of these and not make it back out. But like you see in the picture on the bottom right, there are so many cool caves and glaciers that are also very dangerous as well because we could have, so glaciers pick up rocks as they're moving, and they could have rocks in the ice above you, and they could be melting out and they could fall, or some of the ice could crack and trap you in there, just like a regular cave could collapse. But they're really cool places to be. I've never been in one myself, but I've seen lots and lots of pictures, and I'm very jealous of the people who have gone in them.
There are also river systems inside of glaciers, and the openings to these look like caves. They're called moulins, Moulin, so I think I'm pronouncing that right. And these are really interesting because it's water running through them. So sometimes you'll even see rivers kind of on glaciers, and they'll go into these moulins. And a lot of them, scientists are unable to track where they go or where they exit. They've tried putting like dyes into it to see where like the dye will go. So it's very interesting that the internal system of a glacier also includes a river system.
They're so complicated, but so cool.
Nellie had another question about animals. Do animals live in glaciers? Typically, no, just because of the lack of vegetation, because it's all ice. But alpine animals like birds or small rodents might live nearby. It just kind of depends, but typically none are going to live like in the glacier or like call that its home.
Any other questions that you saw, Betsy, that we missed?
Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. All right, Sarah, will you go to our next slide?
Yes, ma'am.
So for those of you who may be new to Girl Scouts, who want to learn a little bit more about who we are and what we do, we are having an event this week on June 18th. We're having 2 different times for you to join us, so 11 a.m. or 6 p.m. You can follow the information on this slide for more, and we would love to see you there. Again, if you're not a Girl Scout and you'd like to hear more about this and see if this is something for you, please feel free to join us. We'd love to see you there. And for everyone, thank you so much for joining us for our Geology of National Parks. Sarah, what are we coming back with in 2 weeks? What's up next?
Oh, goodness. You put me on the
What's
spot
over your
there.
head?
Oh, we are doing Arches and Canyonland National Park. So we are traveling all the way to southern Utah in this next National Park series. We're really excited. Mattie used to live in southern Utah. I have spent many, many weeks there. And so we're very excited to do that one.
Yes, I both studied geology in Utah and taught geology there. So very close to my heart. So we look forward to seeing all of you there. And thank you again just so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Bet. Okay, Betsy.